Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to be consolidating a lot of my old information on corset modifications, alterations, repairs, and whatnot. And in this video I'm going to talk about when it would be worth it to kind of go DIY, whether it's best to leave it to the professionals, and when it's time to just cut your losses and either sell your corset, use the funds for a different corset, or just throw away. Before I start, I will say that if you absolutely hate sewing and you have the funds to commission somebody else for alteration and repairs, there's absolutely no shame in doing that. Back in 2010, I made a video called Should You Buy a Corset or Make One? And I went into all the math of how much money you would be saving if you were to make your own corsets instead of commissioning somebody else. But it depends on your willingness to learn. There's a really steep learning curve when it comes to making corsets. And if you are lucky enough to have a job where you earn more than, say, $30 an hour, that means that you can work 10 hours and use that $300 to pay a professional corset maker to make your corset versus spend 20 hours making the corset yourself, and it might not be quite as good quality as somebody else. So in the first situation, you would actually be saving yourself 10 hours, and that time you can do with whatever you want with it, relaxing or whatnot, and you might get a better quality corset in the long run. Of course, in my case, I found it really fun to make corsets, so it was not a waste of time for me. And the same goes for altering your corsets, modifying them, embellishing them, repairing anything that might have been damaged. So there is no shame if you do not want to go the DIY route and you would rather just have somebody else do it. With that aside, let's now go on to fitting alterations. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what should you do if the hips of your corset are too narrow. So let's say you got a corset in the mail and it's not curvy enough. You need more space in the hips. Well, if you cannot exchange it for a different style and you would rather modify it in some way, then if the corset is constructed using the sandwich method and only the sandwich method, then you can probably do hip ties. That's probably the fastest and easiest way to go about it. Bonus with hip ties is that as you're cinching down, say you're a waist trainer and you are gradually making your waist smaller over time, then you can adjust each hip tie to fit you comfortably, and it will always fit flush with your hip. Because when you have a corset with a fixed hip measurement, there's a narrow window where it fits best, that it's neither, flaring away from your body nor pinching in. Adding hip ties might take, say, 2 hours if you know what you're doing, or give yourself 4 hours if you are not quite comfortable and you've never dealt with grommets before. Now, if your corset is not made with the sandwich method, you probably can't add hip ties. Or if you don't like the look of hip ties, then you can add hip gores instead. So this is increasing the circumference of the hip, but it is a fixed hip measurement, as I had mentioned earlier. It's easiest to add a hip gore by slashing in the middle of the panel, as opposed to, take out the boning and pick out all the seams in between the panels and all that. Adding hip gores would probably take you 4 to 6 hours, depending on how many gores per side you want to add. The second fitting issue we'll talk about is the ribs or the underbust being too small for you. So some people ask if rib ties are a thing, and I mean, technically, yes, you can add rib ties, ties on the top half of the corset, the same way that you do it on the bottom half of your corset. But generally speaking, a corset places a slightly more pressure on the ribs compared to the pressure that's placed on the hips, especially if it's a conical rib corset. And if you put in rib ties, you will probably not be able to retain that conical silhouette. When you add ties to a corset, the way that all the tension is distributed, it will kind of automatically become more of a cupped rib corset. But my concern is that over a longer time, those laces might get uncomfortable pushing against your rib cage. So I would recommend adding rib gores instead of hip gores. And same if you have like a overbust corset where the bust is too small, add bust gores and not ties. And with gores, you can still control how conical or cupped you want the rib cage to be. Third fitting issue, the steels in the back of the corset are too stiff or they're hurting your back. They don't curve with your natural lumbar curve. This is a pretty easy fix. You don't even need a sewing machine for it. Just use your hands to gently curve the steels and fit the curve along your back. So this would take maybe 10 minutes. You can do this in the front too, by the way, just bending the busk itself or the bones adjacent to the busk. It can create a slightly kind of spoon busk effect where if you have a protruding tummy, the busk will wrap around that tummy and even wrap underneath it and kind of pull it up and in. However, if you're an extremely slender person with a low body fat percentage, I would exercise caution before bending the busk to create a spoon busk effect, unless you are specifically experiencing some sort of lower tummy protrusion when you're wearing a corset. Because if you already have a very flat tummy and your pubic mound tends to protrude a little bit, then having an inward bent busk might just end up jabbing you in the pubic bone, which might not be comfortable. So if you're the type of person that kind of has that issue, you might actually feel more comfortable bending your busk outwards at the bottom instead of inwards. So bending the flat steel bones particularly pertains to the steel bones. If you're dealing with an antique corset and you want to bend the bones, which I hope you're not manipulating it, but I mean, if it belongs to you, then that's your prerogative. Then you're probably going to have to steam or wet the bones in some way. Otherwise, it's going to be too brittle to bend. And if you're dealing with a corset that has carbon fiber bones in the front or back, just don't even bother trying to bend it, because it's not going to bend. The amount of force that you can put on it, like as a human being, it's probably going to resist bending. And if you try to bend it by machine, then it's going to shatter. So yeah, don't do it. And somebody is mowing their lawn in the middle of a rainstorm. Fourth fitting issue, the corset is too long for your body. So say you have an underbust corset that just kind of pushes up on your bust a little bit too much. Or say it's a long line corset, but when you go to sit down, it hits your lap uncomfortably. Or say you have an overbust corset that you want to turn into an underbust. You can cut down the top and or bottom edges of a corset, although it's a bit of a more complicated job. I do have a tutorial on this as well though. So what you would do is you would remove the binding, remove the bones, cut down the corset fabric, cut down the bones, retip the bones, put the bones back in, sew the binding back on. So this might take 3 hours if you're really savvy with it. Give yourself at least 5 hours though if this is the first time you're doing it. Fifth fitting issue, your corset is too short for your torso. Unfortunately, there isn't really an effective way to lengthen a corset. If you are stuck with that corset, then you can pair it with some shapewear to hold in whatever the corset is not supporting. So if your corset is too short at the bottom and you have a lower tummy that's kind of protruding out from underneath the bottom edge of your corset, then you could wear it with some control top briefs. Or if the corset stops too low on your rib cage, then you can wear it with a long line bra, and that might help to control some of the spillover that might be happening. But honestly, if your corset is too short for your torso, I would just exchange it for a longer one, or if you can't exchange it, then just sell it and use the funds towards a longer, better fitting corset for you. 6, your corset is too big or too curvy for your body. Is it possible to take your corset in? It is technically possible to sew darts and or pleats into your corset. So for instance, I have a light colored corset here. I have seen, oh, that's a lot of glare. I have seen some people who just kind of, they fold it like that and just sew down the pleat like that. But it's not a good idea, because that can create pressure points on your body. You see the inside there, like that ridge is pressing on your skin, and it might be under pretty high tension depending on how tight you're lacing. So I would not recommend that. I discussed this previously in my sizing down your corset video. It is possible to, take your seam ripper and, take apart every seam of the corset, cut it smaller, put it back together. But there are so many seams in a corset that ripping those out might weaken the fabric of the corset, and it would often take longer to, take this whole thing apart and then put it all back together again, than it would be to just make a new corset from scratch. So what I would do is I would start with new fabric. I would cut a new corset, and if you have your old corset, you can harvest the busk and the bones out of it and reuse it in your new corset. Or if your old corset is still in pretty good condition, you can sell it off and use those funds towards a new, smaller corset for yourself. So if you were to make a completely new corset by yourself, give yourself, 10 hours if you're pretty experienced, 20 hours if you are kind of like me and you're like very, very slow and deliberate and like a perfectionist. And if you were to take your seam ripper and take apart this entire corset and then put it back together again smaller, double your time. As a bonus, let's also talk about modesty panels. Some people really hate modesty panels, so if you want to remove it, it takes just a couple of minutes of your time. You just take your seam ripper and remove that row of stitching that's anchoring it in, and Bob's your uncle. Unless it is a what Katie did corset, in that case you would have to cut it out because it is sewn right into the lining of the corset, and you don't want to compromise the integrity or the strength of the corset. Now, if you don't like those attached unstiffened modesty panels, but you want to keep your modesty panel maybe you want to bone or stiffen the Modesty panel and like suspend it on the laces. This is also a really easy task, and I guess give yourself about an hour to do it. So I think I covered most of the major fitting issues regarding off-the-rack corsets and whether they can be fixed or corrected, or whether it's better just to kind of cut your losses. If I missed any, let me know in the comments below. And I've also added links of a lot of my sewing tutorials and modifications and alteration tutorials that I've done in the past, in case you want to see the long version of those and exactly how I did it step by step. If there's anything else that you would like to see from me in the future, leave a comment down below. And if you have any questions or you want some clarification, also leave a comment. I'd be happy to get back to you. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.